Hello, everyone. My name is Jacob Fortin. I'm the host of this podcast, Doers Within Emerging Markets. And I just want to share my experience with using Anchor so far. When the pandemic started, I thought about starting a podcast. And the whole idea was to bring in some really amazing folks that are doing some great work in their respective industries within the emerging markets. And the Anchor platform really helped me get the word out there and also just make it a lot easier for me to invite the guest and just share the amazing experiences they've had and the amazing work they're doing in their respective industries within the emerging markets. So it's pretty fun. You don't even worry about the technical part of making a podcast. You actually just focus more on the content. And Anchor has done it really well for me. So I will highly encourage anybody who is trying to start a podcast to try to use just check out Anchor, and I think you won't regret it. I'm not a technical person, but if you listen to these episodes that I've been publishing so far, it seems like I know what the technical part of it, but Anchor helps you take care of the technical part, and you just focus on the content. So feel free to check it out. I highly encourage you. Won't regret it, and it's right there. You don't pay anything, so. In times like this, I think starting a podcast and getting the word out there, irrespective of what you're doing, will be a really great experience. So thank you guys for listening to my episodes. Please check out Anchor and you will have a great time. So cheers, guys, and see you guys next episode. Thanks.
Female founders and by extension female funders, so investors as well. So to the first point here, I think there's a really interesting idea that I've heard. This is not my own quote, definitely taken from somewhere I don't know where, but basically people have said, women pitch companies and men pitch unicorns, and obviously that's a generalization. Of course, there's nuances there and everybody is different, but I think in general, what's really interesting about female founders and sort of how they might sometimes be disadvantaged in a pitch is that in general, men tend to, in their pitches, highlight, and this is sort of geared specifically towards early stage companies, seed stage companies, which is where my expertise is. And of course, growth is a whole different ball game. But kind of on the early stage side, male founders tend to pitch unicorns in that they tend to focus much, much more on the massive TAM, total addressable market, the massive opportunity, and the massive sort of everything and like long-term vision and painting the picture of the future, which is obviously really important, but it's also really exciting and really interesting to not just VCs, but obviously everybody in general. And on the other side of the spectrum, I think female founders tend to focus more specifically on all the near-term, medium-term, nitty-gritty details. So specifically around, how to get their warehouse or their financials or things like that. And so I think that ends up being really important to actually running the business. But then it also isn't the most exciting thing. I mean, it's not just VCs. I don't think most of us out there would love to, learn more about warehouses or, supply chains, et cetera, at a very granular level. But what ends up happening as a result is that women feel like they need much more facts and figures and practicality to back up their claims and show that what they want to do is possible. And in that process, they end up showing too much that it's possible versus actually showing what it is they want to do. And as a result, VC investors tend to get more excited by these like really macro visionary pitches from men. And I think part of it goes back to the confidence, because women are generally less confident, especially in sort of male-dominated partnership meetings or just a male-dominated field of VC in general. I think there's some crazy statistic that like either it's like 4% of investors are women or 4% of funding goes to women, but either which way, we're definitely super underrepresented in the field of VC. It's not even, 40-60 or 30-70. It's, certainly very skewed in one direction. And so I think as a result, women tend to be especially less confident in these VC meetings. And so they end up feeling like they need to bolster themselves and their company more with all these details around how they're going to do it instead of what they're going to do. And then men sort of feel the confidence or like, oh, who knows how we're going to do it, but we'll figure it out. They're super confident in that, and they're super confident they'll be able to achieve the big vision they're pitching. And so they end up focusing much more on that, and that's much more exciting to investors. And so I think that's kind of a reason why, women kind of take an all too practical approach to pitching, and it actually ends up turning away some investors instinctively. So I think obviously there's a lot of systemic issues to unpack there, and nothing that we can sort of change overnight in terms of the gender imbalance. But I think kind of some things to be mindful of are if you're a female founder, or even if you're a male as well, but maybe just a little bit less confident by nature, or maybe you're a person of color or other minority. I think what's really important is to just, I know it's hard to just say like believe in yourself, because it's certainly not as easy as that, but I think kind of just taking the time to maybe emphasize more the long-term vision, and having backup slides maybe in the appendix showing kind of the details and the financials and the projections and the data, so that when you're asked, you can feel comfortable and know those slides are there to be able to flip to, and know that that information, since you obviously did the research to make the slides. But then during kind of the pitch itself, focusing more on the bigger picture and just noting that you have all the backup data if they want to see it and if they want to talk about it, but you want to kind of focus on the high level first to really set the foundation and the groundwork of what it is you're building. So that's kind of the first point on pitching companies versus unicorns. So the second is female-focused VC funds. So there have been a bunch that have popped up, I'd say, over the last couple of years. It's definitely a newer trend, and certainly, Silicon Valley has been more of a boys club earlier on, and still is, obviously, but I think less so, and there's different great work kind of being done in this area. So one fund I had worked at was Female Founders Fund. This was during school. Definitely check them out. Search Female Founders Fund, FFF, 3X. And so I worked leading their college fellows program, and basically we were doing research for their largely consumer-oriented portfolio companies that were mostly selling into millennials and Gen Z markets. So we're obviously all Gen Z current college students or recent graduates. And so we were able to collect data from our classmates, our friends, in the most unbiased way possible, to be able to help them predict consumer behavior patterns and consumer preferences and changing consumer psychology to further help them refine their product approach. But as their name suggests, they're focused on female founders in particular. And so I think it's really important to have these dedicated VC funds like Female Founders Fund, and there's certainly other ones like Jane VC that's a little bit more recent. I think they raised their first fund last year. I think this was my senior year of college, so last year. So that's another one. And then there's Halogen Ventures as well, SoGal Ventures. There's a whole bunch, and we can definitely include some links as well. But definitely kind of a whole great trend that's happening to VC. I think people are coming around and realizing there is this huge gender imbalance in terms of funders as well as founders, or where the capital is flowing. And I think kind of having this carved out sort of dedicated portion of capital, obviously it ends up not being so much in the grand scheme of venture, but this dedicated portion of capital specifically for female founders is really important. I think also kind of another point on that is when people kind of pitch to VCs. So I think a lot of it is really instinct. I mean, it's not that VCs can predict the future and they're, matching your company to a future that they know. But I think it's very much kind of pattern matching as well as kind of their instincts. And I think women obviously tend to create products for other women, since that's the market they understand most and where they felt pain points and had personal experiences and can connect with and build the best rapport with. But then, women are obviously 50% of the world, and the US population, however you want to cut it, maybe even a little bit more, 51 or something. But I think a lot of times investors tend to be men, and so they'll not really understand the product because they don't understand menstruation, or they don't understand makeup, or they don't understand motherhood or fertility or egg freezing, etc. But then they'll just turn to their wives or their daughters, who are obviously women, but they are not certainly representative of the greater broader population of women in this country, given that usually VC investors who are partners are very upper class, and so are their wives or children by extension. And so I think it ends up happening that a lot of VC investors turn away female founders because they simply don't understand their product and don't make an effort to understand their product, and just quickly do a poll of 2 people, of their wives and their children, who are very clearly, at least as far as we can see, not always representative of females in general for any particular product class. And so I think that ends up being a huge hurdle for women in getting funding. And so I think having these dedicated female-focused VCs and ability for female founders to build this rapport with investors is really important, and female investors in particular, assuming all of these female-focused funds have female investors. And so I think it's really important to have this sort of unique space, not just capital allocated, obviously that too, but also this experience they're able to have with people who fundamentally understand their product. And so I think in terms of takeaways, what male allies or male investors can do in terms of supporting female founders is kind of taking a pause and saying, just sort of taking it analogously. So let's say you're looking at an enterprise SaaS company that you would obviously not be the end user for, since we're, VCs and not enterprise SaaS companies, and as an individual, we're not a company. But kind of taking a step back, so let's say you were evaluating an enterprise SaaS company, would you just say, oh, this, no code tool for, doctor's offices isn't something I would use, so I'm not going to invest? Obviously not, because, by definition, you're a VC fund, not a doctor's office. It's not that every single product that you invest in is something that you would personally use. And so I think kind of just taking that pause, and instead of kind of passing judgment or just saying, no, this doesn't feel right, or this isn't something my wife would use, but kind of doing deeper customer research and taking the time to really understand the perspective of the target customer, whether it's the average woman or any particular type of woman, even ones who are not in your network. And I think that's really important as well. And I think even just sort of like moving more top of funnel. So this is sort of advice I just gave, was kind of more when you're already at the pitch meeting, which is certainly not something everybody makes it to. So I think kind of being more conscientious around top of the funnel as well, where you might have, just kind of inbounds from other men because they see your whole partnership as a group of men, or maybe they came in through inbounds from your friends or other investors who you're close to are also men, given just how male dominated VCs are. So I think kind of making a special effort to get to know female founders, and having a female founders tag on your website even, or showing pictures of women partners more prominently on your page if you have any, and hopefully you do, or kind of writing articles even around just saying that you're open for business for female founders, or even going to particular events like demo days geared towards female founders. I think that's all really important. So I think kind of taking those intentional steps both at the partner meeting as well as creating a more diverse top of funnel in a very conscientious, very deliberate way is super crucial. So female focused startup communities, I guess startup and venture in general, I guess I can sort of speak to them both. But I think kind of a couple of different ones. So Women in VC is this group of like 1,000 or so, obviously women in VC. And so definitely check them out and try to join if you're a female investor. And there's a lot of great conversations to be had. And I think once there's a stronger connection between female funders, it can sort of transcend the funder-founder gap and hopefully create better opportunities for female founders as well. And also if an investor who's a woman and maybe an investor in your company, this is for founders, you can recommend that they join there, and they can hopefully better support you and other female founders. And so there's a lot of discussions there and resources and help around that too. And then obviously a plug for Alpha as well. Alpha is a community of 26,000 women in tech, venture, and startups. And so basically it's this sort of forum, kind of like a Reddit in many ways, where you're able to ask questions that are top of mind, or even doesn't have to be a question. It could just be an article or a thought that you want to share, something you want to get advice on, maybe a more pointed question, anything like that. You can just feel free to share anonymously or as yourself, and then people will pretty much always respond with really thoughtful comments and feedback and sharing their own experiences. And so it's been a really supportive, really positive culture. And the one sort of thing to note is that you're able to post anonymously, but only after you log in. And so it's a curated community, not in terms of being selective or exclusive, but just making sure everybody is well-intentioned. So everybody's, truly a woman in tech-ventured startups when they come onto the platform. And so I think that's kind of a unique aspect, and that's sort of what's helped to create a really positive culture. And then there's also, aside from the forum structure, there's also events and job opportunities specifically from companies that are trying to hire more women and being deliberate about that. So that's really great. And then also there's different featured posts that I lead, so different writings from members as well as interviews I've done. And then we also have AMAs, Ask Me Anything, also known as office hours, that I also lead with sort of more high profile women. Like in the past, we've had the CEO and the founder of Glossier, we've had the CEO and the founder of The Wing, we've had Eileen Lee, who's on the Midas list, and the founder of Cowboy Ventures, and so lots of really interesting people. And so AMAs, you can, as the name suggests, ask them anything and they'll respond to your questions. And we have a new 1 or 2 people each week. And so that's a little bit on Alpha. I definitely recommend that as well. SoGal, I think, is a venture fund, but they also have lots of different events and virtual pitch nights all around the world in local communities. And you can even start one in your local community if there isn't a chapter yet. So it's a sort of decentralized model where you're able to get more plugged in as a female founder to female VCs and other allies in your local community. And I guess nowadays everything's quite virtual, but I was part of the community in Boston when I went to school there, and it's a really vibrant community of not just investors and founders, but all kinds of supporters, obviously mostly women, but really tailored towards supporting female founders and building a whole ecosystem around that locally. Next point is advice for female investors at male-dominated funds. So I think kind of what's really interesting here is kind of my own experience too. So I obviously am a woman investor, and everybody who works in my fund, I work in a pretty small fund, to be fair, so it's not like 100 people, I'm the only woman. That would be a little bit crazy, but we're a super small team. I'm actually the first full-time hire, and so understandably, I am the only woman, but we don't have many men either. We just have a very small team, and it's been a great experience so far, so nothing kind of wrong with that. But I've always kind of thought about how I could help female founders more, kind of being in this male-dominated industry and male-dominated firm. Obviously, I wouldn't really have this question if I were at like a female founders fund, for example, or like an all-female partnership. But I think obviously most women end up working just statistically at partnerships that are all male or mostly male. And so I think this is an important kind of area to hone in on. But I think a couple of things that you can do. So if you're not in a check writing capacity, obviously if you're in a check writing capacity, that's a little bit different and you're able to have a lot more agency over what you invest in. But I think most people are associates and analysts just by the numbers. And so they're not in a check writing capacity for the most part. And so just like myself, I can't write checks since I'm an associate, but I think kind of something to think about is even if obviously you can vouch for the company and do your diligence and present your work and try to make a good case and sell the opportunity to your boss. But if you can't, or just, if they're a little bit more stubborn and not able to come around to a check writing comfort level, I think what you can do is introduce them to other female funders, and maybe some people with check writing abilities, or just these other communities that we've spoken about, or female focused VCs in general, or even other associates who could be good champions for them at other funds, even if those funds aren't female focused. And so I think that's kind of one thing you can do. Another thing you can do is sort of help them in kind of these low friction ways of like reviewing their deck, for example, and providing pointers, kind of going back to the first point on pitching companies versus unicorns. You could share that insight that you've had with them. I think that could be really impactful for them, because for many of them, it's sort of their first time pitching, where they just don't have as much experience. And so kind of one value add you can have from having seen many different pitches, women and from men, and sort of building a model around what's successful, at least in terms of getting money. And so kind of sharing insights around that. And I think the last thing too is just sort of demystifying the process. For female founders, I think for them, VC seems like a really opaque world. And I think, to be fair, a lot of people think VC is a really opaque world, and it, you know, probably is. I'm still trying to figure it out myself, but I think to the extent that you can, try to explain to them, you know, how do partnership meetings work? What are the typical main pushbacks that VC investors have? You don't have to agree with them, but you can just tell them, you know, what you've seen and what you've noticed, so that they can sort of further craft their pitch, and things like that. So that's kind of what I would recommend there. And then advice for female founders for my alpha interviews. So I think what's interesting too is that you have to I think sometimes people feel uncomfortable like changing themselves. I spoke with Laura D'Asaro, who's the founder of Chirps Chips. So they basically create chips, and then now, baking powder or like cookie mix, I think is what you call it, cookie mix. I'm not a baker clearly, but they create cookie mix and bars and chips out of cricket protein. And so they're basically trying to solve the sustainability problem, obviously, as we've seen now more than ever with, you know, the news I'm sure everyone has heard around the meat packing plants being shut down, or just being these huge COVID hotbeds, and, you know, meat shortages everywhere. And obviously meat has its own sort of both, people have animal rights concerns around it, as well as sustainability, greenhouse gas emissions concerns around it. And so I think kind of something to focus on there is, using insect protein instead of meat protein. Obviously, insects are technically meat, but they're also very protein rich and very nutritious, and also don't harm the environment nearly as much. And there's no kind of farming component, and they're obviously very low/no maintenance. And so they've been kind of pioneering that movement, which has been quite interesting. But sort of in short, one thing she had mentioned was that when she was calling manufacturing sites for the early days when she was trying to find a manufacturing partner for Chirps Chips, her co-founder, who's also a woman, had told her to lower her voice. And initially she was like, why would I change myself? You know, that kind of feels really strange and really weird. And I think instinctively that's how we all feel. But I think kind of what is really important is sort of, you know, not telling anybody to change themselves or anything like that. And it's obviously totally up to you, but I think sometimes you do have to alter the way in which you present yourself, or the way in which you present your deck or your opportunity, just to be able to open certain doors. And it's really unfortunate, but I think unless or until there is this sort of like systematic change, I think that there won't sort of really be an opportunity to kind of just go at it full force. And so I think you do have to make some short-term sacrifices. You know, maybe you do have to, in Laura's case, like make their voice a little bit lower, or your own voice a little bit lower, you have to maybe change your pitch deck and make it more about the unicorn opportunity versus the data or the numbers backing it up. And so I think kind of thinking about different ways in which to work with the system, even if the system isn't ideal or nearly ideal. And so I think first step would be to really understand kind of the biases that people have. And obviously some of them are obvious, you know, just against women or against people of color. But I think kind of going deeper of like, maybe it's higher pitch voices that they have, aversions to, or maybe it's people talking too quickly, or maybe it's this particular type of deck or particular type of presentation of an opportunity. And so I think kind of understanding where people's pushbacks are, and not saying they're right, because they're usually wrong, since bias of any kind is not good. But I think kind of understanding where, having a more nuanced understanding to like where people's hesitations instinctively, a lot of it is subconscious, but I think kind of having this nuanced understanding is really important, and being able to work from there. So yeah, that's a little bit on my thoughts here, and hopefully that was helpful.
That was really good. I think kind of you touched on the main key points on women entrepreneurship and VC, which I think is very important right now. I think even moving forward post-COVID world. So this is really good. I really liked it, and I think people find this really important. I just have a question in terms of, so for the female-focused VC fund, how do you think that will shift the paradigm? Like, I know you kind of mentioned earlier, 4% of capital allocation goes to women. Approximately, it might be lower. the role of VC fund, I think the FFF you mentioned, and the other ones, how do you think that will really have like implication or, kind of shift, capital allocation towards more women? I know like women are actually more in terms of, population in the United States, right, than men.
Yeah.
So evidently they have to do a lot more work on that. So what's your take of that in general? Like, do we need more female-focused VC fund, or do we need to go into already existing funds and kind of encourage them to hire more women?
Yeah, totally. So I think what's interesting is it's really much an upstream problem. So Female Founders Fund, for example, the person who founded it is, or there's two founders, but the main person is Su Tian Dong, who's actually no longer with the fund. She's working on something else now, but she, let me just sort of see her background really quickly, but basically prior to founding Females Founder Fund, like she was a prolific investor, like she, had such great credentials, and she had worked with like other funds before, and she had been a really great, she was at First Mark, which is like this really, really great pre-seed fund. They basically invested in like they've invested in like Pinterest, for example, and like a bunch of other companies that ended up going public, and I think they have a bunch of people on the Midas list every year. And so she had a really great background in investing with this really great fund. And she also had really great operating experience, having co-founded a company before and working at head of marketing. And she came from Stern and had great business experience there. And so basically, I think with her background, people would have thought she would have been able to raise a fund super easily. And she also had a partner, the partner is still with the fund, but her name is Anu, and Anu was previously a serial entrepreneur herself, London Business School, and like just super prolific person as well, and had some really great exit. But then they actually pitched to, I was reading their story, and they had actually pitched to hundreds and hundreds of LPs, limited partners, who all rejected them, whether immediately or like over time. And so I think that's pretty typical as well. And like JNVC too, like they really incredible like Harvard grad, previously was investing with a really big, I think it was Excel or something, but a tier 1 fund, and had a senior leadership role there. But then she was only able to raise $2 million, which is really small by VC fund standards. So I think a lot of it is upstream problems, because it's, who can these VC funds raise from? These people aren't putting in their own capital. I mean, maybe they are, but it's not going to move the needle unless they're like Jeff Bezos or something. And so I think it's really about LPs, and sort of LPs, I think sometimes they're like fund of funds, and so they don't end up like being super in tune with like micro level, not like micro, but like more specific trends. They just look at macro trends of like enterprise versus consumer, or like China versus the US, or emerging markets versus non-emerging markets, or where are interest rates these days, or things like that. And they don't end up getting into the nuances of like diversity and culture, and gender balance, and things like that, because they're just so high level. And also they tend to be like super large organizations like pension funds or endowments, and so they're great obviously, but they end up being like slower moving. And so I think there's kind of a lot of impact that they can have that they don't even realize that they can have. But I think when and if they're kind of more mindful about that, it'll shift the landscape. But I think the bottleneck isn't so much in the funds themselves, because they ultimately have to raise, and they have to continuously raise in order to be able to do follow-ons and continue to support the companies they invested in, and continue to invest in more new companies. You have to constantly be raising a fund like every couple of years, and having kind of gone through the fundraising process myself, obviously not with my own fund, but with my current fund, it's so much work, and you definitely do end up pitching hundreds of people, even if you're like already have a great track record as an investor, a great background, great operator background, you're a serial entrepreneur. It still takes years and hundreds of pitches. So I think there's a lot of, kind of challenges for anybody raising a fund, but I think also especially for women raising a fund. And I think part of it comes from like LP pushback or hesitation.
Definitely. And just the kind of, I think, summarizing and maybe something that in our fourth session, people will be able to ask Q&A or will be able to consolidate some questions. I think one that I'm just curious about, kind of to end this session, is in the COVID world and post-COVID, are there opportunities for female entrepreneurs to start a new type of company? And do you think, I think something like that, like, do you think women will have more opportunities in this COVID world and post-COVID, or it's going to be similar?
I think what's interesting is that, with childcare in particular, I think people are coming to realize, obviously everybody knew childcare was a thing, but I think parents in particular, both parents, mommy and dad, they're coming to realize that childcare is actually a huge kind of problem and a huge, area that is actually super challenging, both on the people who innovate around it, the teachers, everybody who's involved. And I think before, women, took jobs outside of the home, like, they had their professional full-time jobs, and they would also take the lion's share of work at home. And as a result, women started to drop out of the workforce at sort of alarming rates, and definitely rates higher than men, because they had just so many responsibilities with their children and with just like housework in general. And I think men, and I don't think it was intentional, obviously, because I don't think anybody's like malicious, but I think there was just sort of this underappreciation of the housework or children related work that women do at home by their partners, so their partners didn't fully appreciate it. And I think now, because their partners are only like home, kind of swinging in at night for dinner and then going back up to their office, or in the morning just leaving the women with the kids and driving right off to work. But I think now that everybody's at home all together all day long, men are starting to realize as well that it's actually a really challenging job, being a parent and taking care of kids, and it's not appreciated nearly enough. So I think that people are going to start to figure out ways just right now in the interim of like dividing housework more evenly, just because you kind of have to right now to like be able to survive and manage your kids. But then I think that patterns stay, and realizations and eye-opening experiences stay and last. And so I think moving forward, there will be kind of this greater appreciation for women, whether it's just women, professional in general, and I think that kind of spreads to female founders and funders. And so I think there will be a lot of opportunities there that are hopefully more positive as well.
Those are great points. And so, that makes sense. I think that's one positive thing that came out of COVID, right? For men to really appreciate kind of the hard work that comes into it. So, but Jessica, thank you so much. I think this is very meaningful. I think just having someone like you that works in VC, and based on your track record and kind of what you're doing, that by itself is an inspiration. And I think that's one of the main reasons why I reached out to you to organize this series, because I think, this is a very good example of, someone who breaking into the VC world and actually trying to lead others within your generation, but also inspiring people, in my generation as well. So I'm both men and women, not just women. So I applaud you. So much. Definitely. So thanks again. I think I really enjoy it, and I hope others enjoy it as well. Thank
you for having me. It was really great to speak with everyone, and look forward to the next one on China and emerging markets.
Yes, I'm excited about that too. So
thank you so much. Great to speak to you, and have a great weekend.
Yeah, you too. Thank you, and thank you guys. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.